Each year when I open my notes to Kinnos, the first piece is a piece I read. I always like to share it, but after a few years, it sort of personally feels that it's lacking. And it's a line from the Sfas Emes. It's a line from the Chavetz Chaim. The Sfas Emes, approximately 150 years ago, writes, Mashiach will be here very soon. Many years have passed. Many have wondered, Sfas Emes, where's Mashiach? The Chavetz Chaim similarly writes that if you look in the Torah, you'll find calculations until the year 2087. And he says, don't worry, because many years prior, Mashiach will be here. The Chavetz Chaim wrote this approximately 190 years ago. And 80 years after, the Gula will be here very soon. We've heard from our Gedolim, from Chaim Kanievsky, from other Gedolim, that yes, Mashiach is right here. At each level of tsarais, we're told, we're taught, we believe that Mashiach is indeed around the corner. But then another Tisha B'Av comes, another Tisha B'Av goes, another Pesach, the days of Gula come, another Pesach goes, and we at some point ask ourselves, what do we do now? What exactly are we supposed to do? We keep on being told Mashiach is here, but clearly it isn't. So perhaps the words that we read last night from Yirmiyah Hanavi, the title, Eicha, is the answer. And maybe that's the way we could open up Kinnos today. The word Eicha means how. Rosh Hashiva Vichil Perez Hatzal writes so eloquently, wondering, the word Eicha is the wrong word. The word should be Lama. Why? What's the word how? The question that the Navi should be asking is, Lama, why are we sitting all alone in a city with so many people? Why does Yirmiyahu Hanavi choose the word Eicha? And he explains so beautifully that the word Eicha means how. And Yirmiyahu Hanavi is expressing complete astonishment, bewilderment, that Klal Yisrael was warned. Klal Yisrael was graphically and so many times told that if you don't change, the Churban, destruction will happen. And yet, it did. And therefore says Yirmiyahu Hanavi, Eicha, how? How is it possible? How is it possible with all the warnings, with all the foretold destruction? For as many times as we're told, if we don't get better, if we don't get closer, if we don't try to open up our hearts a little bit, it will end in destruction. Eicha, how is it possible? How is it possible? And as we walk into another kinnis, perhaps that's the lesson that we have to start with, is at each of these junctures that yes, Mashiach was around the corner. And indeed, all the different times, the different tsarais that we went through could of course brought Mashiach. And the question was, how did we respond? Did we do enough? Or in the words of Yirmiyahu Navi, Eicha, how could this be? How could this be that we're still sitting here on the floor, that we sat there on a Simchas Torah, we sat there reading the news reports, seeing the world crumble around us, trying to be better, trying to be closer. Eicha, how could it be that we're here again? Of course, each generation that doesn't bring the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash means that we caused its destruction. Eicha, how could it be? How could it be that once again we have to sit and mourn, that we have to try to connect? How could it be that we didn't get the message that there's more to life? How could it be that we didn't finally realize that we have to give up all the stupidities, all the vanities of life, and we just have to be a little bit bigger? So as we walk into Kinnis, yes, the words of the Sfas Emes are indeed true. And yes, the words of the Chavetz Chaim Of course, we're indeed the truth. The power is in our hands. And maybe, just maybe, if we spend some time being a little bit more real, thinking of what we haven't done, of what we could have done, and then utilizing that to move forwards, utilizing that to ask ourselves that penetrating question, Eicha, how could it be? I'm sure we all had a moment during COVID when we thought the world was collapsing around us. And I'm sure there was a moment that we thought, okay, I'm finally going to get it right. I'm finally going to leave this behind. I'm finally going to make this change in my life. I'm finally going to live a life that Hashem is proud of. And then life continued. I'm sure there was a moment when we heard the news about Eretz Yisrael and Simchas Torah, wherever we were, that it was almost a choking moment, wondering, is this real? Is this real? And those who watched any of the terrible movies, films, recordings of what happened, we asked ourselves, this is 2024. This is happening in our world. These are footage that we expect back from the Holocaust. These are stories that we tell over of a world gone by. And we always say, well, we can't connect to the Holocaust. It was so far ago. We don't understand what it means, gas chambers and rounding up Jews and beheading them and killing them and shooting them in cold blood. And then it happens right in front of our eyes. And then we watch that and then some. And we then do what? Slowly, one after another, our excuses are taken away from us. And in case it's not enough, and in case we're not low enough, then we hear about the terrible conditions that our fellow brothers, our Yidden, are sitting in, hostages for days, for months. And then when one gets released and they tell a story, and we listen as it's a gripping tale, how they're taken here, how they're put here, how they're subhumane conditions, how they're made to do this and that. And we listen like it's a theatrical movie. And we watch it like it's so incredible. And then we hit next and we move on with our life. Eicha, Yirmiyahu Hanavi, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is indeed talking to each and every one of us, and he's telling us that we have to become better, we have to become closer. The Gula, of course, could come. It's us that are needed. It's true, the Gedalim of yesteryear were able to sit and cry. They say the Chassam Sefer filled up a full cup of tears. Rabbi Ruderman writes that he saw the Chafetz Chaim crying. I could say I saw Rav Asher Yeli on a Tisha B'Av, that when he picks up his head from under his talis, the shtender is sitting there wet. We've all seen such great people. But then we sit, we try to connect, we try to feel it. And we're told that it has to be, you have to cry. The Shari Dima'is Loinin Alu. But we're not able to. We're not able to. Perhaps it's true. Perhaps the physical tears have at some level dried up. The physical manifestation of pain is lacking, but there's no question that our neshamas are crying. There's no question that as we sit and as we become a little bit more real, a little bit greater, as we sit during a kumzitz and we connect a little bit deeper, there's no question that we're indeed crying. And what happens when we cry? What happens when we become real? What happens when we become vulnerable? What happens when we allow all the tsaris of the world to hit home and form that pit in our stomach, thinking how many tens of thousands of children our age throughout the whole Eretz Yisrael have been displaced without homes, nowhere to live. And we start thinking about it in a real way. And we take for a moment and we think that maybe someone our age could be fighting. And maybe he could be sitting there, enemy combat, or maybe taken as a hostage. And that pit and that lump forms in our throat. Those are our tears. Those are our ways of connection. And when we cry and when we connect, what that does is it creates the kesher to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that much deeper. It makes us that much greater. And sometimes that is the necessity of Tisha B'Av, is for us to realize that we are greater people, that we could indeed connect to Hashem. Because sometimes we're so pathetically low and our lives are so fast and joyful and running through life. Of course, there's also Torah and there's also mitzvahs and there's also tefillah. But everything is so fast and so quick that that element of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not there. We're lacking it. And it's similar, many, many mishalim. But one that hit me last night was someone said to me last night, did you lay in Eicha last year? And the answer was absolutely not. And I thought, did I ever lay in Eicha? And I realized there was one year I lay in Eicha. It was a year when a few days prior I was here in camp with everyone else. And I had a toothache, which then became a swelling on my cheek, which a doctor, a surgeon, a specialist, each one probing and pushing, crazy pain, this like big ball on my cheek, and no one knew what it was. We went from one to another. I eventually went to my pediatrician back in Rockaway, and he takes one look and he says, Avi, if I touch it, it's going to hurt. I said, thank you, doctor. The first one, everyone else took these metal probes, and it's only going to hurt a little bit. Straight up, not sure why. And he says, okay. And he picks up the phone and he calls my mother and he says, Mrs. Slansky, which hospital would you like to go to? And I wasn't on the other end of the phone, and gave a choice of two different hospitals. And he says, okay. I was with my brother, can meet him at the hospital, and IV for at least 48 to 72 hours, and Amir Tashem, things should be okay. I walked out of the doctor's office, still didn't really understand much. I knew I have to go to the hospital to get IV. But when my mother called me frantic a few minutes later, Avi, you okay? I said, yeah, Mom, I'm fine. Nothing changed. And over the next few hours, when I get, you sure everything's okay? I realized that there must have been more to that conversation than when I walked out of the room. The doctor said what maybe the concern was. And we were in the hospital, it wasn't 2, it wasn't 3, it ended up being 5 days. And the last day was a Tisha B'Av. And on that Tisha B'Av that I spent in the hospital, that night of Tisha B'Av, that was the only time I sat there and I read Eicha, laned, read, whatever I was able to do. And the most telltale sign was when I left the hospital, the doctor said to me, Avi, you don't realize how sick you are. I said, what do you mean? I had a growth, IV. He says, no, no, no. You know, when the whole team came in and they started taking pictures and they started writing and they started, I was like, yeah. He's like, yeah, because there's a disease that has been extinct for at least 50 years called the Black Plague, the bubonic death. Somehow that trace of bacteria you picked up, and that's what was festering inside your mouth and growing and growing. And Baruch Hashem, we caught it, and the IV was able to stop it before it got to your eye, chas v'shalom, or anywhere else. But realize you were very, very sick. We're sometimes so sick that we don't even realize how sick we are. We sometimes are so disconnected from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're so far, we don't even realize that we're that sick patient. We think everything's fine. Okay, so the hospital was a little bit of a bigger deal. Okay, an IV line was a little bit of a bigger deal. Okay, so there was a CAT scan, an MRI. Okay, some doctors came in. No, what's the big deal? That's the life we live. That's all the occurrences that happen in the world. As Hashem talks to us and it gets closer and closer. And unfortunately, what's our response? Like myself, that juvenile kid saying, no, what's the big deal? So an IV, so a doctor, so a picture. That's like Kadosh Baruch Hu talking to us, and it gets closer and it gets closer and it gets closer. And sometimes it gets very close to home. But we have to want to stop it before chas v'shalom, the IV, the medication can't work anymore. So when we sit here on Tisha B'Av, we have to realize that now is the time to stop all those tsaros. Because where do all the tsaros come from? Where does all the disease All the horrible hospital stays, all the hostages, all the deaths, all the random quote unquote accidents, all the young children. Where does this all come from? This comes from that Hashem just put it on autopilot one day and there was a mistake in the algorithm. This comes because this is what Golus is. And when we live without a Beis Hamikdash, this is the day-to-day occurrences. And when we read stories in the Kinnos of parents eating their children, of people dying right and left, it's no longer a long ago. It's something that we could relate to. And we have to realize it's getting very, very close. And now is the time that we could stop it. We don't want to be guilty once again of being the dar that doesn't bring the rebuilding, which is akin to its destruction. So as we remind ourselves, Eicha, and we realize that yes, we got all the warnings. All the warnings in the world are getting closer and closer. And we know of what's going on in Eretz Yisrael and the surrounding and the Milchama and what can get worse. It's now the time that we could realize we could bring Hashem into our life. Rav Yisrael Salanter famously remarked, Kinnis are like the tefillos of Yom Kippur. And the kirva, the closeness that we feel to Hashem on Tisha B'Av is that same closeness of Yom Kippur. We all know what that Yom Kippur, that last Hashem Alekim is, that last Baruch Shem, that moment that we realize that's a perfect, there's no longer any doubts at that moment. That moment that we realize that yes, we need to live a life of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is where we could get to on Tisha B'Av. So as we sit here, as we read, as we listen, as we try a little bit to get a little bit closer, to find ways in our own personal life, not just to feel the tsaros, not just to cry in our neshama, which is incredibly important, but to find ways in our own life to become a bit closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is the purpose. That is the reason why we're sitting on the floor. And hopefully, and with this I'll conclude, if we find that place in our lives, we won't have to do this again. I'll conclude that when we hear many stories, often we respond, if I was the person in the story, would I be able to do that? If I was that kid in the Holocaust, would I make the right decision? If I was put with the test to either give away no one else's child or listen to the Rav and allow my child to be taken, would I make the right decision? And unfortunately, we often question, would we have the strength to do it? And I sat with a Holocaust survivor, my wife's grandfather at Pesach Seder, and so candidly, and I've repeated this so many times, he turned to one of the Einiklach and he said, if you were there, you would never have survived. You wouldn't be able to do it. And maybe from a perspective of strength, there's some truth to that. However, if we were to realize that we're really doing that much more, then I think we could realize and connect with all the stories that were told. If we realize, as all the Gedalim of years gone by have taught us, that all the nisyanis that we have in one day, in 1 minute, don't equal to all the nisyanis of the entire shtetl. If we realize that we're so far and we have so little feeling and we're still trying to sit on the floor, if we realize that that is worth more than anything else, then we could realize that indeed we are making the right decision. And we're doing that much more than just not pulling the trigger, that much more than surviving starvation. We're surviving a different type of starvation. Yes, we might have food and we might have all the luxuries of the world, but we're surviving a starvation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the lack of closeness that we feel. And yet, we still are all sitting here. And yet, we sat last night for hours singing, trying to get closer, trying to find a way to connect. Yet all of Klal Yisrael, regardless how far we are, how low we've become, how distant we feel, how little bit we understand, we still all try to find ways to connect. And that indeed is that much greater than any of the stories that we will hear. So when you hear the next story and you question, will I be able to be that one? Realize you are, and that much more. Realize that just by trying to sit here, by asking ourselves that question of Eicha, how could this happen? We don't want another Eicha. We want to find the solution. We want to come closer. We want to find ways to bring HaKadosh Baruch Hu more into our life, to withstand another Nisayon, to da a little bit more Torah, or just living life with the cognizance, with the realization that Hashem runs this world and we do not. That little detail is the greatest detail of all. That is that much greater than any Holocaust story, than any survivor story, than any warrior that we'll be hearing about. Because that is something that's between you and Hashem, and there's no applaud and there's no honor that you're going to get. But that is true greatness. So hopefully, as we sit here, as we ponder, as we try, as we don't want it to be another year, put on that calculation towards the year 2087. We want it to stop at the year 2024. We want no longer to ask Eicha. We want to not be that clueless sick boy in the hospital, not realizing that all the doctors are concerned, that no one, and he's sitting there like, it's just IV. We have to realize how sick, how low we are. And with that, when we make that commitment to be a little bit closer to Hashem, to bring Hashem a little bit more in our life in any area, whether it's Torah, whether it's Tefillah, whether it's Avodah, whether it's Chesed, whether it's being nice, whether it's another bracha, another Amen, one more thought of Shmir Seinayim, or again, just living with the realization that we do not make our decisions, but Hashem is the one in control, then hopefully, b'siyata d'shmaya, it will not be another year that has come and gone. It will not be another year with all the warnings of all the Nevi'im, the hostages and the fighting, but rather it will be a year that the last time we will have said Eicha, and we'll understand the answer to the question. Emir Hashem, as we reveal our neshama, we bear our souls and we allow ourselves to become a little bit more mature, a little bit greater, connecting on a deeper level. B'siyata B'shmaya.